Hello, everyone, and welcome to the beginning of a podcast that we will hopefully continue to do far into the future. I am honored to be joined by Dr. Naveen Maliakkl. Thank you for being here, sir.
Thank you.
So, Dr. Naveen, thank you so much. We both kind of realized that there's a serious problem with health among Catholics and among Americans in general. So I really think this is an incredibly important topic of just learning more about health, especially in today's landscape. As I'm sure you're aware, health is an increasingly important issue. Our RFK just ended his run for the presidency and talked a lot about health. Hopefully, that can have a good effect on our country's health. It seems like it's a leading political issue and it's growing in interest very quickly. So, we're doing this podcast here, Mind, Body, Soul, a Catholic perspective on health, to increase everyone's understanding of health, and especially among Catholics. So, of course, this is going to be from a Catholic perspective. So, first of all, I know this is what people are going to be very interested in, Doctor. What are your qualifications? What do you know about this topic? Like, how can you speak about this?
You know, uh, MD, graduated from, this medical school, graduated from this residency program, certified in this, certified by the Board of Internal Medicine, aren't particularly helpful, I think, in a lot of ways to helping people with respect to how to live a healthier lifestyle. Unfortunately, um, my best qualification is kind of my own kind of personal study on the matter, which is really brought upon by watching a lecture by a physician, a pediatric endocrinologist named Robert Lustig while I was in medical school. It's called A Bitter Truth. And then later watching his second his talk after that called Fructose 2.0, and it kind of made me realize that if I want to help people kind of get healthier with respect to lifestyle, just general lifestyle recommendations, better have myself before recommending it to people because um, you can read in books about to recommend this, that, or the other thing. It would be almost like if you were a weightlifter or sorry, a trainer for a bodybuilder or a weightlifter, and all you did was ever read about these exercises, but you never had performed them yourself. You're not going to be the greatest at actually coaching the movement. Well, if you haven't actually engaged in um, adjusting your lifestyle to improve your health and figured out a way on how to execute that, you're not going to be particularly helpful, with helping other people do that as well. And there's also the kind of the inherent hypocrisy of, being, say, like the 300-pound endocrinologist who's telling people to lose. If your recommendations were so good, you would take them yourself and improve your own life. So it was one of those things that kind of led me down that path. So I was kind of just eliminating things, mostly diet wise, and just kind of seeing how I felt. So first sugar, then grains, and then various other things, and then I gave up vegetables for a while, and that was actually the most dramatic kind of change. And I'm currently like just mostly outside of Lenten Fridays for the most part. Kind of like a carnivore lion's diet kind of person where I eat mostly just beef, salt, and water. And I've never felt better with respect to my health doing that. But then that caused me, after doing it for you know many months, to wonder why I wasn't dead. Because everything you would learn in medical school means would signify that you should be dead. You shouldn't be able to live on such a diet. So that kind of sent me down, in looking into like, well, why am I not, going downhill? Why do I feel better than ever on something that no, mainstream doctor would ever kind of recommend? And that kind of leads you down the path of, looking into what the underlying causes of diseases are, understanding things about metabolic health and the importance of mitochondria, and then finding other people in the space, whether they be just your average Joe or kind of famous doctors or famous personalities in the space like a Ken Berry or a Sean Baker or an Anthony Chafee or people of that ilk. So I've learned a lot in these last, what has been, like, about 6 years or so, uh, on this journey. And uh, that's kind of what I'm trying to put into practice, and a practice that I have here in Jacksonville, Florida.
Okay, so for 6 years you've only done beef, salt, and butter. Is that what I heard?
And water, outside of Lent,
Okay.
outside of Lent. Initially, I should say, when I was carnivore, it was mostly chicken and pork in medical school because it was cheaper. But decently into residency, it was pretty much almost exclusively beef. Um,
So
and then, like,
that's a lot of
uh,
discipline.
um, there is, and it depends on the type of person you are, right? When you talk about discipline, like, for some people, moderation is more discipline.
Hmm.
You think about it like, you know, um, in a way, it's like, not to say that it's not eating bread or sugar is not a sin, but to make the analogy, right? If you have a problem with a sinful behavior or a vice, right, you do not put yourself in occasions, right, in which that vice or that predilection to sin can come out, right? Some people, though, have great mastery of their intellect over their concupiscible appetites, for example, and therefore they can exert such moderation that they don't need to be full on, like, eliminate every near occasion of sin completely, right? Like, they um not to say that, you should ever willingly just throw yourself into it, but they're not as affected as other people are. And I think, in that way, uh diet or lifestyle can be similar in that regard, where some people, it is easier for them to completely eliminate something from their life. And the cognitive load and the discipline is actually less than having that temptation around you all the time, and having to say no every single time you see, say, a box of cookies in the pantry or something like that. If it's just not there completely, then, like, all right, it's not here. I have to really go out of my way to get it. But I know what I have, right, available to me are things that, in this context, we will say are virtuous, right, with respect to, say, beef or water, from that perspective.
And just to go back to what you said at the start of my question, I believe what you were saying was you were implying that we'd be better off if we listened to people who were healthier instead of people with more credentials. Is that pretty much the essence of what you were saying?
In a sense, yes. Like, the American medical system has proven to be quite good at fixing you when you are acutely broken. Like, you are having a heart attack, you want to be in America to get, like, a stent immediately, right? Or if you need a surgery, right, immediately because you were in a car crash and you broke your leg or you're bleeding from the inside. Obviously, medicine has made large strides with respect to infectious disease because of antibiotics. But with respect to chronic disease, it is hard to argue that the American medical system has done anything but fail catastrophically, when you look at the rates of cancer, diabetes, heart disease, and all sorts of chronic diseases, especially when you take into account that smoking has gone down considerably since the 60s and the 70s. So
Yes.
things have just gotten completely worse.
Yeah, well, I think we're going in the right direction here because my next question is what is your evaluation of America's current health situation? It sounds like you've kind of given a bit of a picture. Did you want to elaborate at all?
Yeah, it's there's a lot of problems there. Ultimately, we have a healthcare system that's really, really good at fixing you acutely, and really, really bad at helping you prevent you from becoming broken in the first place. Um, and one of the things that, is the case with respect to how bloated and how poor the medical system is just the amount of money that is spent in America on healthcare. Like, health should not be something, chronic disease management or chronic diseases really should not exist, I would say, if people have proper lifestyles for the most part. Um, there are going to be some unfortunate souls in particular circumstances, but for the most part, it should not exist. But when you have trillions of dollars being spent, um, and that number seems to only be going up, whether it's, the destruction of society through fiat inflation, the subsidy of insurance, which kind of diffuses costs and creates a moral hazard problem. You can have the problem of intellectual property, which pushes companies to then research things that can be patentable, right? Because if you can find a treatment that is able to fall under a patent, then you get a monopoly. Whereas lifestyle, you can't really patent. I mean, you could copyright like Weight Watchers or something, but
Hmm.
you can't really patent, a ketogenic or a low carb or a carnivore lifestyle in general. There are all sorts of um, there's all sorts of factors that led to kind of where we are. But that is a very long discussion. You could spend hours on
Yeah.
each individual topic if you wanted to.
Yeah, and speaking of keto and carnivore and like a fasting kind of lifestyle, all of those involve consuming less things. If you're only eating meat, you can't really patent meat. You can get meat anywhere. If you're fasting, you're consuming less food. So I don't think that's really a way to make money is to tell people to fast.
No, and you see like right, what are the margins for cattle ranchers? They're not very big,
Yeah.
right? The margins are in mass producing kind of junk. Whether it's industrial sludge called seed oils or we could also call them engine lubricant that are in diet. And then you can get into talk about like the subsidies in the 70s and the move towards go bigger or not go bigger, go home, get big or die, I think is the colloquial phrase used to describe Earl Butts's policies in the 70s. Um, you know, you have this kind of you have a lot of forces that force centralization into these types of mass producible kind of foods.
Yep.
But we also have you also it's not just eating less, but it's also just eating more nutrient dense. So if you think about like the effects of like inflation, for example, a cow takes, let's say a grass-fed cow takes like 2 years to bring to market, right? If you all of a sudden print a ton of money and desirable things like beef go up in price, well, how long does it take to bring a new cow to market in order to increase the supply in response to the increased price? It takes a while. It takes 2 years at least, right? You have to have a cow pregnant, you have to have them give birth, it's a 9 month gestation, then you have to raise the cow. It takes a while. You're talking 2 to 3 years. Whereas you can always slash new fields to plant more wheat or more soy or more corn and bring a new crop within a year.
Yep.
So um, it's a very different calculus, and then you can see the price differentials, for example, between the most nutritious foods like beef, lamb, and goat get wider and wider compared to, say, refined flours, refined sugars, and industrial sludge or engine lubricants that we call seed oils.
Yeah. And maybe seed oils are not such a bad thing to talk about because we don't have to get too into it, but I did want to ask, how do you think our country's health compares to the rest of the world? Because I don't think other countries are using seed oils in the numbers we are they?
I mean, there are a couple examples. Maybe the UK and Israel would probably be up there in terms of their seed oil consumption. Um, but yeah, it is kind of a very interesting and unique phenomenon. So people when you talk about health, especially in these kind of like low carb spaces, they have their kind of ideas as what's like causing things, right? So like if the idea of carbohydrates of any kind being kind of an underlying problem, and obviously the more refined the carbohydrate, the worse, but still all carbohydrates have some inherent risk in them.
Yeah.
Um, I think, more in the Tucker Goodrich camp, or Dr. Curley camp, who's also seed oil disrespecter, I think, on Twitter, um, thinking that there are high carb societies and there are even societies that eat, a decent amount of fruit, usually at the equator, that don't have the same degree of metabolic disease. But when you bring seed oils, really what we're talking about is a particular fatty acid, an omega-6 fatty acid called linoleic acid, and not even the general quantity of linoleic acid, but what it gets metabolized into. Um, when that is in excess, that can kind of drive mitochondrial dysfunction and metabolic dysfunction. So I think the seed oil problem is a unique one in the setting of human history because you never had the processes to refine these things with all the detergents and the mechanical pressure and the heat and all the process is quite a lot of steps um, to actually create a seed oil, like a canola oil. Um, but it is a very unique kind of thing in our human history that really has, if you don't talk about like cottonseed oil kind of getting popular in America kind of in the late 1800s, we're talking a little over, let's say at most like 150 years of like real heavy seed oil use. I mean, you had some seed oils that were used in smaller quantities, right? Sesame oil and things like that. Um, to be clear, olive oil I would say is a fruit oil. Same with coconut oil because you're not actually, you're not actually pressing the seed. Though olive oil has its problems in America, but it is one of those. It is one of those things that I think is unique, and we see a lot of rising diseases when you see a nation or a people transition usually from a traditional source of fat to some kind of seed oil.
Right. So we consume a lot of seed oils here. We're exporting seed oils to other countries. We have not been, as humans, we've not been consuming seed oils for very long, looking, in the context of human history. And obviously, there's a lot of factors. Neither of us think seed oils are the only problem with our diet. But do you think that the trends of rising seed oil usage in recent times is correlating with a lot of health problems?
Yeah, I would say that when you look at it, it's not. I think there are certainly correlations that go with it, especially when you see ancestral populations that get access to seed oils. Because your best comparison would be, you know, a population that did not have seed oils. You introduce seed oils. What happens to them? And also have, I think, better studies with respect to the underlying mechanisms. So, for example, like the studies done with a lipid emulsion or a TPN, which is a form of nutrition that you get via an IV when you can't swallow, called intralipid, which is known to cause metabolic, not metabolic syndrome. It's just known to cause insulin resistance. In fact, there is another example, which is a sad one, is when babies are born prematurely and they don't have developed guts. Sometimes they end up getting fed via the IV via TPN, and they can develop fatty liver from the infusion. And the actual treatment for that is actually a fish oil based infusion called Omegaven. So we can kind of see that, you know, these there's all sorts of kind of inklings that show that this is kind of the issue. The tricky thing with respect to the literature is that the names aren't always the same. So when you hear about, if you read studies and stuff like that, they might not say anything about linoleic acid specifically, or they may not say anything about seed oils, but they will talk about like lipid peroxidation, which lipid peroxidation is the oxidation of polyunsaturated fats, particularly linoleic acid, in the context of the human body. So when they're talking about lipid peroxidation causing XYZ problem, they're talking about seed oils effectively when it comes to diet. Or if they're talking about various metabolites, which actually I think are really driving the issue of linoleic acid. So you're talking about 4-HNE or acrolein or leukotoxin A, all of these kind of things, when you look at papers looking at those particular types of things and their negative consequences, right? They may not mention that, oh, these are the byproducts of linoleic acid metabolism. So that's where you can get into some interesting waters where it's, you could see a paper where they're like, well, this person had a bunch of linoleic acid floating around and there were no problems, right? And someone else had low linoleic acid but had high metabolites of linoleic acid and was, doing pretty poorly in a particular scenario. That would be akin to saying that, oh, this house that's on fire, it doesn't have as much gasoline in in the house. Storage stored in tanks, as opposed to this house that's not on fire. Well, that makes sense because the gasoline's been burned off, right? It's actually being used in the process, right? And you can see the house on fire. But to say like, oh well, because there's less gasoline, there's more gasoline in the house that's not on fire, and there's less gasoline in this house that is on fire. To say that gasoline is not, causing a causative element in the fire is a little absurd, right? We would see that on its face. So it's actually really tricky, and then that gets into a whole discussion on medical research and how badly it's done. You also have the issue of, and this gets into when you subsidize, and you see this in a lot of fields. It's called like credential creep, where people need more and more credentials just to get a similar type of job. You see all these people being subsidized to go to college. Well, this creates a glut of people trying to get into medical school, and how they have to differentiate themselves are based on whatever criteria the medical school picks. So if it's, activism, a particular political ideology, or if it's just being able to crank out a ton of research papers, regardless of the quality of the research, right? Which kind of pushes, uh, undergrad students and then medical students and then even residents to just essentially act as effectively, cheap labor to be able to pump out really, really garbage studies to just say like, hey, I published, 5, 10, 15 papers. It's just a numbers game, you know?
Hmm.
But the problem is in any of these kind of systems, when you're looking at a problem like this, you have to understand or have to look at what are the incentives. In other words, who gets punished for bad ideas or bad actions, right? And if you're in a research setting in which you are insulated from the outcomes of your research and you benefit from the publication of that research, but not the actual hard outcomes in real life, then you're going to have a different set of incentives than someone whose idea to be tested in the real world and they live or die, or their success is based on its actual implementation being successful and not just a paper being published.
Right. So, yeah, I think people who have health problems, they have a real incentive to figure this stuff out and try to figure out what's going wrong. Me, for example, I think that most health problems are lifestyle caused. I think we cause most of our health problems. I think diet is probably the biggest thing in health. That's just my opinion. But the way that the modern world treats health, it seems like we idolize drugs as if they're the most important aspect of health. So I just wanted to ask you, doctor, what do you believe is the most important aspect of health?
Well, so the most important aspect of health, well, as Catholics, the most important aspect of health is health of the soul, first and foremost, right? Like, it doesn't matter how great your body is. If you end up going to hell because you're in mortal sin, it's all for naught. So you have to always keep in mind that the purpose of a healthy body is to assist you in the efforts to save your soul in compliance with God's grace that He gives you. So that's the most important thing with respect to health, because we shouldn't separate these two things and act as if they are, kind of a Nestorian view of the body, where it's like you have a soul you and you have a body you, right? Um, which isn't the case. Um, but with respect to overall health, it shouldn't be that diet is like the greatest distinguishing factor. It shouldn't be, I think, because if we were, like I said, if you were able to, if everyone ate not industrial junk for the most part, right? You wouldn't see as much of a differential in people with respect to health with respect to how their health is based on diet, because we'd all be eating hopefully like a pretty decent diet, and then the things that would be our our issues would be, do you smoke? Do you do drugs? Do you engage in risky behaviors? Especially like driving and things like that, where you're acutely putting yourself in peril, or is your job in particular, like, particularly dangerous and more likely due to injury? But in this environment, yeah, diet seems to be the most important thing. But there are also other things to keep in mind. Sleep, chronic stress. Stress, really, God made us to be stressed and then to be able to come down from the stress. But modern life seems to be about chronic low levels of stress all the time. Then obviously, to some degree, maintaining flexibility and strength throughout years, as we see, especially with old people, right? The thing that actually kills a lot of old people or is really devastating is a hip fracture. And where does a hip fracture come from? Comes from mostly it comes from people who fall, just falling from a ground level position and fracturing their hip because they aren't able to walk well. They've lost a ton of muscle mass, they've lost a ton of bone mass, and they become rather frail.
Hmm.
Um, that those are all things with respect to lifestyle. Like, those are probably our four big pillars. But given the modern environment, diet is probably number one for most people in things that they can fix in order to lead a more healthy life.
Okay, and so you said obviously the soul is the most important thing. I 100% agree with that. But for you, the four pillars, you said diet, sleep, stress, and exercise. Were those the four?
Yeah, that
Okay,
would probably be the four pillars with respect to that.
to like
And
so.
some of the exercises. And some of the exercise is kind of imposed, right, because of how modern lifestyle is. So, for example, one of the things that allowed people probably to maintain good hip flexibility and good knee flexibility over time was the fact that when you had to go to the bathroom, there were no toilets. You had to actually be able to get into a squatting position, which actually improves, reduces the risk of constipation. That's why people have these squatty potties, is actually to try to get into that position without actually being able to squat. But when you
Mm.
have, toilets where you don't actually have to squat, now, instead of squatting once or two or three times a day, you're not squatting at all. And eventually you lose that hip flexibility. How many people can squat where their hamstrings and the backs of their legs are touching their calves, in America? Unless you're actively trying to develop that skill, or you're a child, right, who hasn't like lost that ability, right? You probably, for the most part, without falling backwards, or just being like, I just can't, I can't be in this position at all, or rounding your back and starting to have your back hurt or anything like that. But we all had it, because anyone who sees a 2-year-old walk around can see them squat effortlessly,
Mhm.
right? So it's, we all had it, but we end up losing it, and a lot of that, some of it does have to come with the fact that modern lifestyle kind of is set up in a way that isn't that conducive to health. It's conducive to a lot of things. Another example is like artificial lighting, right? Before, good luck trying to do any major work after the sun went down, right? Does it make you more productive? Yes. However, does artificial lighting, particularly fluorescent lighting, also mess up your circadian rhythm and affect your ability to produce melatonin, affect your ability to go to bed? Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, blue light blocking glasses is one of the things I recommend for a lot of people who are struggling with trying to get to bed. But we now are saturated with it, with our phones, our computer screens, our fluorescent lights, right? Because the Biden administration then made incandescent bulbs, I think, illegal in like 2023. So you see a lot of lifestyle medicine nowadays is really about reversing kind of the consequences of modernity, where in a way, this is maybe a strange way to look at it, but God has kind of kept us a little bit humble, hopefully, kind of in a Tower of Babel situation, right? We as humans have invented so many wonderful things, right, that allow a material prosperity that was never possible before. But at the end of the day, right, there's only so much the human can do with respect to human nature, right? With respect to how we are wired by God, and try to bypass that or circumvent that in order to achieve something in a material sense. Um, and this is like one of the big failures of, kind of communism. If we think about like a philosophical issue, right? Like, you know, you think about the ideas of like idealism versus empiricism. If you're familiar with those concepts philosophically at all,
A little, not
a
too
little.
much.
So think about it like this, right? Like, there's a reality that is outside of you, right? So that reality, it exists independent of you. If you go away, that reality is still present. Right? This is most obvious in the case of God, right? So in a truth happens when the subject and the object effectively kind of meet, right? Where subject understands the true essence of the object. That is knowledge, right? Idealism is essentially the subject creating knowledge based on its own ideas, like independent of the external reality. So, for example, if I said that I was a woman, contrary to all external reality, right, that would be me making a statement of truth that has no basis in reality outside of my own intellect.
Mhm.
And you see this, in medicine sometimes. If a particular paradigm, or in any field, if a particular paradigm, regardless of the evidence or the reality to the contrary of that conclusion, is essentially brushed aside, right, and acted as if it does not exist, right? Just like, if I thought I was, if I thought I was a turtle, and you clearly could show that objectively I am not a turtle, yet I still went to, believe that I was a turtle, right? You would essentially diagnose me correctly with like a mental disease. But this is how idealism works, and this is how, for example, things like communism kind of come about philosophically. Is you have this idealized nature, or sorry, not idealized nature. You have this idealized view of man that is completely independent of reality. right? That you can just mold man into anything that you want to be. And once you get essentially an idealism of idealism in there, in that sense, right? Everything is up for revision, right? In the same way, we can kind of see that in Pascendi, Dominici Greci's. Um, then you have the other thing with empiricism, where if we understand that there are, things have matter and form, right? And they have an essence to them, meaning like the truth about something. So, for example, a table has an essence to it. If I paint the table red, it does not change the essence of the table, right? It still has, we talk about Aquinas' four causes, right? It has a material cause, a formal cause, an efficient cause, and a final cause, right? But with criticism, you effectively reduce everything to something that is inherently unknowable with respect to its essence. Like the only thing that you can know are the things that you can observe. So really all you know in the philosophical sense are accidents about it. So I actually don't know what the essence of a table is, or what a cat is, or what a human is, or what a man is, or what a woman is, or what a particular disease is, right? All I know are these things that I can observe about something. And then I kind of collect all these factoids, right? These accidents, these accidental characteristics, and I collate them into something called a cat or a dog or a medical disease. The most obvious example of this is in psychiatry. So in psychiatry, all of these diseases or syndromes, right, or things aren't defined by an underlying cause. They're defined by a symptomatology. So essentially, like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder or depression, they are defined by what the symptoms are, right? What those end outcomes are, and you bind up all the symptoms, right? And then that's how you get your diagnosis. But this leads to, and any psychiatrist will agree with this, is that you get a lot of overlap between conditions because not everything, fits, right? Or there are symptoms that overlap and you're not sure what is what. It's because you don't know anything about the essence of the disease, right? You only know these symptoms, right? Or these kind of accidents, these accidental natures of the disease. So you get a problem then in medicine where medications or treatments, from an empirical perspective, are meant to target that which you can observe about the disease, right? If you can't understand essence and you can only understand it by its accidents, then your treatments go towards solving the accidents or the symptoms of a disease. So here's another example. Let's say you have type 1 diabetes and type 2 diabetes. These are fundamentally not the same disease. One is a disease of metabolic resistance, insulin resistance, metabolic dysfunction, right? And leading to hyperinsulinemia, et cetera, that manifests itself over time in high blood sugars. Type 1 diabetes is a paucity of insulin, usually an autoimmune condition due to a lack of production of insulin. So we have a situation in which your body is metabolically dysfunctional and is compensating by creating more insulin. But the insulin resistance is so bad, or your ability to make insulin in response to the insulin resistance isn't good enough that your sugars go up. In type 1 diabetes, you have close to, if not no insulin, and your sugars are high because of a lack of insulin. Anybody who has an understanding of just basic reality would understand that these two diseases are not the same at all.
Mm-hmm.
But if you consider them, these are diseases of high blood sugar, instead of what the underlying issues are, then your drugs to target those diseases will be, in a lot of ways, similar, because you think that the underlying problem to fix is that which you can easily observe, which is the blood sugar being high. In a sense, it's an analogy of this. It's like the drunk man who is trying to look for his keys in the alley, and there is like one lamppost, and the only place he looks is the area of the lamp that the lamppost illuminates, because it's the only area that he can actually observe. And that, when you're wondering why are all these medications in part only kind of dealing with symptoms or the end consequences of a disease process and not the underlying cause, in a lot of ways it's a philosophical issue that goes back, to Francis Bacon and company in the Enlightenment with respect to empiricism. But then you see idealism about also particular treatments, right? Where regardless of outcomes or side effects or consequences. Some treatments are pushed as you must take this. This will make you better no matter what, right? Regardless of the evidence, right? And that's where you get into kind of people almost dogmatizing in an improper sense, right? There's a proper place for dogma, with respect to the Catholic faith, but not with respect to medicines, right? When faith is not meant for natural things; it's meant for supernatural things. And in some ways, there are some problems with respect to just when you think about medical education, like that's how doctors are raised is to treat symptoms, to treat those things because the treatments that you're offered, surgeries, medications, these are what they are trained to do. And in a lot of ways, to ask many doctors to think about things differently would be like to ask a hammer to function as a screwdriver, right?
Right.
All they are going to see because of their training is a nail. So if it is a screw, if it is a bolt, they will still try to hammer it because if they or when they recognize that a hammer is not applicable, they don't know what to do in a lot of cases. It's more difficult to understand the root causes of things. But at the same time, if you believe that we're made by God and we're not the byproducts of like some accidental, random, kind of random walk of evolution, then you're going to think that we were made not broken. I mean, the fall, obviously the fall was the fall, right? And had some consequences, obviously, with respect to the body, but we were made in a way that was particularly ordered to an end, right? Both the body and the soul. Whereas if you kind of view us as this kind of random byproduct of chance, right? We were the slime that was some electricity and some molecules got together and made some kind of primordial ooze that evolved into all living things. Um, then you are like, yeah, like this is just an evolutionary process. It's kind of random. They could just make mistakes along. They could just be full of mistakes and full of things that are just like, oh, we need to actually engineer our way to fixing this underlying broken system that you're assuming is broken. It's like needing human intervention to be able to thrive.
Yeah, and if we're just a product of evolution, there's no way to know that our logic is even worth relying on. There's no way to know that there's anything outside of ourselves that's worth pursuing. Nothing really matters
Well, so
anyways.
that's where, well, so that's actually the logical consequence of empiricism is ultimately agnosticism and then nihilism. Because if you can't know essence, right? If you cannot know truth, if you can not know the thing itself, I think that's the Kantian term, is that you cannot know the thing itself. You can only know these kind of like, kind of another example is like, oh, if we're all in a dark room and there's an elephant, right? And we're kind of padding around like on the elephant trying to figure out what this thing is. If all we can know is what we are feeling in the dark about the elephant, you're never going to know the truth. And then the question becomes, well, if you can't know essence, then how can you know anything kind of truth? So then everything becomes up for grabs. That leads to agnosticism. But then if you can't understand truth or if you don't know the causes of things, right? Because you can't know truth, right? If you can't know cause and effect, which is a form of truth, right? In that sense, then is any action you do worthy? Like, does it go towards any purpose, right? Because if you can't reliably trust that cause and effect exist, then what's the point of doing anything? And that's where you get to nihilism, right?
Yeah.
So yes, you kind of understood that right there. Is that these are the kind of like these philosophical errors are very pervasive in society, not just in medicine, right? You see it all the time, right? This idealism kind of notion is also kind of like manifested in society with the whole like, well, I'm living my own truth, as if you owned the truth, right? So we see a lot of these issues, go back even deeper than sometimes we think. They're almost at a base level of kind of like the philosophies that have come to dominate society over the past goodness 400 years.
Yeah, I totally agree with you that our society has detached ourselves from the truth. We're not living and thinking in line with physical reality, and I think it makes me think back to Matt Walsh's movie What is a Woman, where he had a conversation with two women and he asked them, do you think we're having this conversation right now? And they couldn't answer him. They said something like, well, if you think we are, then sure. It's just like everything's subjective. But with so much just flawed ways of thinking and so much medical misinformation, Are there any other big misunderstandings or big misconceptions that you wanted to address?
Well, I think I think a lot of people end up getting frustrated, I think, with respect to medicine because they do what they're being told. And I think there is an inherent desire to want to trust authority, which makes sense. If I bring my car to the mechanic, I want to be able to trust the mechanic, right? That he knows what he is doing and that he is doing what is best, right? Now, granted, could he be doing it purely like for the money? Sure, but if there are enough mechanics there, right? He'll probably have his reputation ruined if he messes with too many people, in a bad way, with respect to his knowledge. But you want to be able to not have to crack open the manual and learn how to become a mechanic in order to make sure that the mechanic is doing the right thing for you. The same thing goes with medicine. I think people want to be able to trust in their authorities. They want to be able to listen and to get guidance, to get counsel, right? That helps them in their lives and not have to figure out everything for themselves. Unfortunately, if we look at the outcomes, just objectively on the outcomes, people have, decreased red meat, have decreased saturated fat intake, have increased polyunsaturated fat intake, right? Sugar was thought of as benign for a long time. So in lieu of saturated fats, it seems like people have increased sugar, right? So they have followed a lot of the recommendations, right? There are plenty of people on, various medications that have been recommended to try to reduce these diseases in their prevalence, and yet the numbers don't really. The hard data is that it just does not look like mainstream medicine has been able to do anything to stop a rise. Now, you could say that they are responsible for the rise. Um, let's just say that they were ineffective against it. The proof is in the pudding in that sense. When you have these, when you have children now becoming obese and diabetic, when type 2 diabetes was thought to be a disease of purely adulthood, you really do have a problem, that all these recommendations that have been followed. Have they been followed perfectly? No. Has everyone gotten to zero red meat and just is chugging canola oil all day? No. But it has certainly shifted where it has gotten we have more seed oil consumption, less red meat consumption, and less saturated fat consumption, and things have not gotten better. They've only gotten worse. So it is one of those things where I think people get frustrated with medicine because they believe it's their fault then, right? Because they're like, I'm doing what the doctor is telling me, but I'm not getting better. Or, XYZ did what the doctor told them and they still got cancer, or they still got a heart attack, or they got worse with their diabetes, et cetera, et cetera. And then that can lead you to a kind of nihilism where you're just like, well, doesn't matter what I do. I'm going to be unhealthy or healthy regardless. So I might as well. And then you can see, people just kind of, especially as, inflation kind of destroys the kind of the spiritual and moral foundation of society. You see people and increases what is called their time preference. You see people just kind of living for now and, consequences be darned in the future, because I don't really believe there are any. Like, if I'm going to get sick, I'm going to get sick regardless of what I eat or what I drink. Um, I guess a lot of people are on 5 medications, and you see this lowering of the bar that happens, and it's very hard for people to get out of that mindset when it's been so ingrained, especially in the last 30, 40 years, that oh, this always happens to people when they get older, or this isn't, being on a few meds or 4 or 5 meds is not, now it's, oh well, kids should be on Ozempic and things like that. You just keep moving this down the line. So it's understandable, I think, why people have gotten into a sense of distrust, but also a kind of a sense of, like I said, kind of like a nihilistic kind of sense, a therapeutic nihilism in a sense, or a lifestyle kind of nihilism, because they just don't have they when you lose that trust in the people who are supposed to be the authorities, right? You either are the type of person who is going to try to figure this out themselves, or you're the type of person who is just going to give up. And most people are not going to try to make a second career out of their lives trying to figure out what the answers to their health are, because they have they have careers and families of their own that they're too busy focusing on. So it's something that it just becomes another like, well, if it happens, it happens.
Yeah, yeah, and I kind of think it's been thrust on me because I obviously have a health condition that I kind of felt like I had to research and learn more about. But I totally agree with you. People are busy. Most people don't love to research for hours at a time after a long day at work. They just want to come home and relax. And they, I assume, just like many people assume, that people who spend their whole life doing something are going to know way more than they ever could, even if they did a bunch of research and tried to learn more about it.
And it's true, they do know a lot of facts. I mean, like they do know a lot of different, like I said, treatments in their kind of modality. But you can see, like, like a surgeon definitely knows how to take out an appendix if it's, ruptured better than you better than you will, right? But like I wouldn't recommend that anyone do surgery on themselves like the end of the nick. Um, but it's just a very different thing how chronic diseases are, and it's not as applicable. The mindset and obviously like all these errors that we were talking about philosophically and all these problems, right? Chronic diseases end up becoming something that, even though they may research a lot about them and they know about maybe some basic pathophysiology or basic consequences or medicate, they might have a large library in their head of what medications can and cannot do for this disease with respect to, say for diabetes or lowering blood sugar. It does not mean that they know how to actually fix the underlying thing, because if they did, then we would not be seeing the numbers that we're seeing today.
Right. Well, I would love to continue these podcasts and do more and try to help people figure out how to actually prevent disease, since our modern healthcare system is not very good at prevention. And those are all the questions I had, Doctor. Was there anything else you felt like you wanted to mention?
um no, I mean, thank you for having me on. If anybody is interested or would like to contact me, my practice is has a website, lowcarbdpc.com. I am based out of Florida, but there is an interstate medical licensure compact that Florida should be a part of. Come should be online for it's that's already passed legislatively in the fall. And if you have any interest in joining the practice or contacting me, you can go through the website. The phone number is listed there. The email address is also listed there, which is Florida Low Carb DPC at protonmail.com. Obviously, if you're not one of my patients, none of this is medical advice. I also love to come back for future episodes on future topics and grow this thing out and help people learn a little bit more about their health.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to doing more. Thank you so much. And I will link your website when I post this video so everyone should be able to find you. And thank you for sharing that information because I'm sure a lot of people are going to want to check you out. And so thank you for being on here, Naveem. We'll see you again soon, hopefully.
Thank you.